I don't know, I might like this better actually because it's, tilted up. Our text is the entire chapter of John 9. So if you want to turn there with me, turn to John 9, beginning in verse 1. There's a lot there to read. And I considered breaking it up, but at the end of the day, I figured it'd be best to just go ahead and read through the entire chapter, because all of it is related to what we're talking about today. So just follow along with me as I read. We'll do our best with it here. John chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?' Jesus answered, 'It was neither this man that sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world.' When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, 'Go wash in the pool of Siloam,' which is translated sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, 'Is this not the one who used to sit and beg?' Others were saying, 'This is he.' Still others were saying, 'No, but he is like him.' But he kept saying, 'I'm the one.' So they were saying to him, 'How then were your eyes opened?' And he answered, 'The man who is called Jesus made clay, anointed my eyes, and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received my sight.' They said to him, 'Where is he?' And he said, 'I don't know.' They brought him to the Pharisees. Or I should say they brought to the Pharisees the man who was formerly blind. Now it was Sabbath on the day Jesus made clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also were asking him again how he received his sight. And he said to them, 'He applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see.' Therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, 'This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath.' But others were saying, 'How can a man who is a sinner perform such things?' And there was a division among them. And so they said to the blind man again, 'What do you say about him, since he opened your eyes?' He said, 'He's a prophet.' The Jews then did not believe it of him, and that he had been blind, that he had received his sight. They didn't believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. And so they questioned him, saying, 'Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?' His parents answered and said, 'We know that this is our son, and he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself.' His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason his parents said, 'He is of age, ask him.' So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, 'Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner.' He then answered, 'Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, though. I was blind, now I see.' So they said to him, 'What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?' He answered them, 'I already told you, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?' And they reviled him and said, 'You are his disciple, but we're Moses' disciples. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he is from.' The man answered and said to him, 'Well, here is an amazing thing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.' They answered him, 'You were born entirely in your sins, and you are teaching us.' And so they put him out. Jesus heard that he had been put out, and finding him, he said, 'Do you believe in the Son of Man?' He answered, 'Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?' And Jesus said to him, 'You have both seen him, and he is the one talking with you.' And he said, 'Lord, I believe.' And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, 'For judgment I have come into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind.' Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, 'We are not blind too, are we?' And Jesus said to them, 'If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains.'" And thanks for bearing with me as I read through that. There's a lot there, but it is relevant. It's probably best to just go ahead and hear the whole thing. There's a ton in this chapter. And it's not practical this morning to try to cover everything that's in it. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to hone in on one idea that appears all the way throughout it this morning, and that is the idea of discernment. Okay? This passage is about how to recognize what is of God and what is not of God. And here's what I mean. In this chapter, we see a man who was born blind, and he had his sight restored. And when this was recognized by the blind man's community, they were astonished. And they took him to the religious leaders in search of God's wisdom. In other words, this whole thing looked very much like a God thing to the community. And so they took him to the religious leaders. That is to say, they took him to the spiritual experts to confirm what they already felt was a God thing. However, the religious leaders looked right at this same incredible situation, a man born blind who could now see, and they said, nope, this is not of God. They rejected Jesus, they denounced the miracle, and they eventually put the blind man whose sight was restored out of the synagogue because he disagreed with them and pushed back. So again, this passage is about discernment. It's about how to recognize what is of God and what is not of God. Does that make sense? That's where I'm getting this idea from. And with this in mind, what makes this chapter absolutely fascinating to me is the fact that the religious leaders, that is to say the spiritual experts with all the supposed wisdom and insight, completely failed to discern God's hand at work here. And the common folks of the community were the ones who recognized God's hand immediately. Isn't that interesting? That's the way that it went down. So again, there are big things to learn about discernment here in this chapter. One, how does it work? Also, why did the blind man and his community succeed in discerning? And why did the religious leaders fail? There are 3 thoughts on this that I want to give you this morning that we can glean from this chapter. 3 thoughts on discernment, all right? The first is this. Let's see if I can get my clicker working. The first is this. True discernment is the ability to see and accept what is obvious, okay? True discernment is the ability to see and accept what is obvious, all right? And there's a reason that I'm pointing this out, okay? Often when we think of discernment, we think of things like attuned senses and deep spiritual insight that enable us to perceive things that other people can't see. It's often associated with people who are especially in tune with God through prayer and devotion, and so they can see the true spiritual forces at work behind the scenes, etc., etc. That tends to be the kind of thing that goes in line with discernment. However, that's not at all how this passage presents discernment to us. It just isn't at all. In this passage, Jesus did something very plain and very obvious, and the ones who received it were the ones who were able to simply accept what their eyes and their ears were plainly telling them. You follow me? That's what was going on here. Obvious thing. Plain, obvious thing. And the ones who were able to discern were able to look at it and hear it and say, just trust their eyes and their ears. We see this in the blind man's response when the religious leaders tried to tell him that Jesus was a sinner, not of God. This is what he said, and I quote, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." Do you see how he's like cutting through it all? He's like, I don't know anything about all that. All I know is I couldn't see my whole life, and now I can. This guy did it. So, I'm gonna call this a God thing. I'm gonna chalk it up as a win. Does that make sense? Do you see how plain and simple that is? So obvious. His ability to simply accept the obvious things his eyes were telling him was why he was able to discern correctly here. And the community did the same thing. The religious leaders' failure here was because they couldn't do that. They just couldn't accept what was so plain and obvious to absolutely everyone around. Just couldn't accept it. The reason that we read this chapter, I know it was a long one, but the reason we read it is because this chapter highlighted their failure in painful detail throughout the whole length of it. And so just to give you a replay of what we already read before, first the religious leaders said that this couldn't be a God thing because God doesn't heal on the Sabbath. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, okay? This couldn't be a God thing because God doesn't heal. Everyone knows God doesn't heal on the Sabbath, that kind of thing. Then they said he must not have been blind to begin with. That's why, he was never blind to begin with. And so they went and got his parents and brought him in and examined them. Was he to even prove that he was born blind? And when his parents confirmed that he was born blind and that he had been healed, they said, okay, well, maybe it was a God thing, but Jesus had nothing to do with it. But when the blind man confirmed, it most certainly was Jesus who anointed my eyes and healed me, regardless of what they thought of them, they went back to the initial question and started asking the same question over again. What did he do? What did he do? I already told you what he did. Do you see how they're just kind of going over and over again, over and just keep asking the same thing? It went on and on and on and on. And it was because the religious leaders just could not accept what was so obvious and so plain to everyone else, which was that Jesus healed this blind man. In their mind, there just had to be a different explanation beneath the surface that only those with true discernment could see. Do you follow me here? That's what's going on here. And so this whole idea that discernment is seeing secret things that no one else can see with our spiritual eyes and ears, it can be problematic and deceptive. I'm not ejecting it entirely. I'm just saying it can make you do weird things and do strange stuff that's unhelpful. For example, I can share this now without any issue because this took place a long time ago. But there was someone in this church who was here long ago. Most of you don't even know who he was. He would, anytime a family would move on from this church, anytime someone would say, God is leading me on, or I have family in another church I want to go to church with, any time someone would leave to go somewhere else, this guy would say, there's some foul play going on. There's something you did, Pastor Dan, to upset him to make him leave, and I would get put on trial, and I would have to prove, what did you do? What did you say to these people? I mean, these people would say, we're leaving, it's been great, we're going to move on. He would come to me and say, what did you do to make him leave? And I'd say, I didn't do anything, and it's just actually the whole conversation. And so I'd produce the evidence, and I'd say what was said and stuff like that, and then he wouldn't accept it. And he would go to the family directly and say, tell me what actually happened. What actually went down? You can talk to me. I'm your friend. And they would say, everything happened just the way Pastor Dan did. Everything is true. There's nothing going on here. And then he would reject it, and he'd say, Pastor Dan's coercing you into, covering up for what he's doing. And so he would actually go to my district superintendent and call, and he'd say, I know he's up to something, that kind of thing. And it would just go on and on and on and on. And it was so hard on me. It was so hard in the church. There were so many people confused. There was so much damage done. And in the same situation here, no matter how much plain and obvious evidence was shown to this guy, he just wouldn't accept it. He would continue on his crusade. And he would say things like, there's just something in my gut that's telling me that there's something going on here. And he would spiritualize it too. He'd say, God is telling me to do this. He'd say, God is showing me things. And so much damage was done by this. And he was thinking it was discernment. That's not discernment. Okay? That's not discernment. That's not the way discernment works. That is deception. It's a different thing entirely. And that is the problem that the religious leaders had in this text this morning. They were deceived into not trusting their own eyes and their own ears that God gave them, which were showing them plain and obvious things. They were deceived into not trusting them. True discernment is the ability to accept the obvious things your eyes and your ears are telling you. And with this in mind, when you see people using spiritual discernment to explain why plain and obvious things didn't actually happen that way, watch out. That's a pretty clear sign of deception, okay? You're going to see it happens all around you all the time. Plain and obvious things. We've gone over this 1,000 times. Everyone knows what happened. No, it didn't happen that way. There's a plot. There's a conspiracy. Watch out for that. That's not discernment. That's typically deception. And I could list all kinds of ways this is happening right now. I thought about doing it this morning, but at the risk of venturing into things that are more unspiritual, or we'll just leave that alone and let you guys run with that. We can have conversations about that more in small groups, but there's all kinds of examples of how that's happening. Just remember for now that when something is obvious and plain and people are telling you that it's not and they're spiritualizing it, that's typically how deception works. True discernment is the ability to accept obvious things that your eyes and ears are telling you. And the reason for this, the reason that it's the ability to accept the obvious things, is that in this present age, God works in very plain and very obvious ways most of the time, just like in this text here. Very plain, very obviously, he healed this guy in front of everybody. Very plain, very obvious. God still does that today. That's the way he works in this present age. God isn't speaking in code. You don't need special spiritual eyes to be able to see what God is doing. You don't even need to be a believer most of the time to be able to recognize things that God is doing, right? Because God works in plain and obvious ways that everyone can see, and he's doing this because he's reaching out to the whole world. So it makes sense for him to work in ways that the whole world can see, okay? And this is why when John the Baptist began to doubt Jesus as he languished in prison, Jesus said this, and I quote, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Jesus challenged John to restore his faith by looking at the plain and obvious things that God was doing. You see it there? Just open your eyes. Look at what you hear and see. It's obvious. It's not hard to see God at work. All you have to do is open your eyes and look. All right? And this is also why Jesus speaks about his return as a very obvious thing that no one will miss. All right? When he speaks about coming back and returning, he speaks about it as a very, very obvious thing that no one's going to miss. And follow along with me as I read. "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds in the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." Does this sound like a secret thing? Or does this sound pretty stinking obvious? Very, very obvious, okay? Very obvious. You're not going to need spiritual discernment to see the return of the Lord. Nonetheless, in the first decades of the church, people were already falsely teaching that Christ's return had already happened and that people missed it because they lacked spiritual discernment. Would you believe me if I told you that? Oh, it already happened. You missed it. You didn't have discernment. We had discernment. And that's why I'm quoting from 2 Thessalonians 2:1 right now. "Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed by either spirit or a message or a letter from us as to the effect that the day of the Lord has come." Paul was telling the Thessalonians that the Lord obviously hadn't returned yet. And don't listen to those who say that he did and that you missed it. That's just not the way that it works, because God works in very obvious ways. All right? Discernment is about seeing the obvious stuff, because God works in obvious ways. Deception is about getting people to doubt what is obvious and look for hidden conspiracies and weird stuff that isn't actually happening. Now, a question that we need to unpack for just a couple minutes this morning, now that we've established this, is why is deception so tempting? We recognize that there's discernment and deception, and we see what deception is. But why is it that we're so tempted to get into that? Wouldn't it be easier to just trust our eyes and our ears that God gave us? That's what Jesus is telling us to do. Why don't we just do that? Why do we get drawn towards deception? There's a couple clues about this by looking at the religious leaders in this text as well. So follow along with me briefly as we look at them. First, pride leads to deception. Pride leads to deception. And what I mean to say here is that part of the reason that the religious leaders fell into deception is because they were arrogant and proud. That is to say, they felt that they should be able to see more spiritual things than everyone else. Why? Because of all of their prayer and all of their devotion. These are the spiritual leaders. These are the experts. These are the guys that have spent their whole life in the scriptures. These are the guys that faithfully pray and study and do all of those things. And for that reason, they should be able to see more things than everyone else because they're so spiritual. You know, it's not fair that everyone would be able to see the same things that we do because we're the spiritual ones. You see how that kind of works, you know? When you're zealous, when your religious zeal can cause you to become a little bit arrogant sometimes, is what I mean. And what we see is, we see this coming out in verse 28. I'm going to put it up on the, well, actually, no. I don't think I put these up on the board. So if you guys have John chapter 9 open, follow along with me, because I'm actually going to read these right from the text, but I'm not going to put it up on the board. Just know this. I'm reading from verse 28 now. This is the religious leaders talking to the blind man. He says, "You are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses." You are Jesus' disciples, but we're disciples of Moses. We see it in verse 28. We're the true students of the Word. We're the ones that have we're devoted to the Word, we're studying, we're following Moses, we're doing all those things that we're supposed to be doing, we're above you. Also, if you look in verse 34, it comes out a little bit more plainly. You were born entirely in your sins, and you're teaching us? Who are you to teach us? Who are you to speak to me? Who are you to teach me anything? I'm so knowledgeable, I'm so wise, I'm so spiritual, that kind of thing. That's the way this works. It makes you proud, and pride leads to deception. We've already seen that God's Word, I should say, we should already see that God works in obvious ways that everyone sees. God works in obvious ways that everyone sees. And with this in mind, if we are proud and we are jealous, it can drive us to elevate ourselves above other people spiritually. Do you understand what I'm saying? If we think we're something special, it can drive us in our own minds in weird ways to concoct reasons that we see things that they don't, or we're more spiritual and we're more insightful than them, to elevate ourselves above them. And when we start going down this road, we can start believing nonsense like God chose me for this special purpose, or God is showing me some special insight that he's not showing other people, or I'm specially anointed in some way. We've all heard those kind of things that lead to weird stuff. All right? That's how it happens. It's pride. You need to watch out for that. God does things that everyone can see. So we got to watch out for pride. Pride leads us to deception. But here's another one too. Pre-understanding also leads to deception. Pre-understanding leads to deception, okay? We see this one in verse 16, and I promised we'd talk about it, so we'll talk about it now. But in verse 16, when they were first asked what's going on here, and they talked about this, they said in verse 16, this man is not from God. Why? Because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. He didn't keep the Sabbath. Do you understand what's happening there? Basically, Jesus isn't lining up with their doctrinal statement. You understand what I'm saying? They have ideas in their minds about the way God works. This is how he works. This is the way we've always understood things to work. This is what God does. This is the way he works. And he didn't line up with it. Basically, he's not lining up with their doctrinal statement, the way that they think should happen. And they rejected it out of hand immediately without even looking at it any further because it didn't line up with their structure and their systems. Discernment. Discernment. True discernment involves the flexibility to follow Jesus wherever he leads. And sometimes following Jesus wherever he leads means getting uncomfortable because he's going to lead us into places that maybe are different than we thought. Maybe we weren't so right about God all along. Maybe there's different things that we thought were a certain way, but maybe he works differently. The classic example that I always go to is Acts chapter 10 and 11, where Peter was led into the home of Gentiles, and the Gospels opened up to Gentiles, so they didn't have to become Jews first. I mean, they spent their whole life believing that you had to become a Jew before you could be saved. They were wrong. And the reason that they were able to discern and follow Jesus is because they were able to recognize that God is bigger than their understanding and make adjustments from time to time. When the plain and obvious thing is that God is leading this way and it conflicts with the structure that I had in place. All right? So pre-understandings, inflexible pre-understandings prevent us from being able to follow God, and they lead to deception. All right? True discernment is simple. We're going to want to go ahead and get Holly, and we're going to want to go ahead and get Janice and all them up here. Really? Okay, that's new. True discernment is simple. True discernment is not hard. It's simple and it's not hard because God works in very obvious ways that are plain to see. What makes discernment hard is when we've got a bunch of funny ideas in our mind that are blocking us from being able to see the truth that is right in front of our eyes. And what I mean to say here is that oftentimes growing and walking with the Lord is more about unlearning the nonsense that got put in there than learning new things. I used to always think it was about learning new stuff, but it took me a while to realize that there was stuff that was already in here that was blocking the truth from going in. All right, those things get in the way, and those things lead to deception. And so my prayer for us this morning is that we would be able to trust our eyes and trust our ears and be able to see the obvious things that God is doing, and that he would give us eyes to see and ears to hear, and he would unblock those things that are getting in the way from us being able to see and hear. And with that said, would you pray with me at this time? Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are reaching everyone, that you're communicating with all of us, and that your gospel is going to the whole world. And you're working in ways that all of us can see, that you're accessible to everyone. And we pray, Lord Jesus, that we would be able to have eyes to see and ears to hear the things that you are doing. And that you would use us as instruments to be able to communicate what you are doing to others. And Father, help us to always be aware of deception and things that cause us to close off to what you're doing and what you're and the way you're advancing your kingdom right now. We thank you that you're working. We thank you that you have given us discernment. And we thank you that you have given us your Spirit and your word. And we pray, Lord Jesus, that we will be able to follow you with it in Jesus' name.